So good day, everyone, and welcome to our session for our Clinical Center Summer Course. For today's program, I'm going to be talking about why are patents and commercialization so important for scientists. And I'm Steve Ferguson. I'm a special advisor in the Office of Technology Transfer. So I hope as we go through this course, this program today, you find some interesting ideas, interesting things you can apply to your own research program at whatever institution that you're working on. So let's get started. First of all, let's talk a little bit about technology transfer and commercialization itself, and particularly the role of scientists, because I think that's really what's most relevant for you. That's really kind of why you're here today. So in terms of technology transfer, well, you may have heard the phrase, you may be somewhat familiar with it, but what we're really talking about is the movement of information, materials, technology from the research laboratory to the commercial enterprise. So kind of this flow out from the bench. And this all is utilized then to support further research and development to make new products. And here at NIH and healthcare institution, those new products are improved public health. But I show it here as a two-way arrow because it's actually a two-way street. Not only does this information and ideas flow out from the bench at NIH and other research institutions, but through our partners, our collaborators at companies and universities, this information and the materials can actually flow back. So it's very important that we keep these channels open and that your work is connected to this channel to really benefit and advance your science. So why would somebody want to do this? Why is this important? Why are we including it in the course this summer? Well, a couple of reasons come to mind. First of all, it does provide a means for getting these ideas into innovative products and moving them to market for public benefit. While not many people in walks of life or institutions read scientific papers, they do appreciate the benefit of seeing innovative products coming from the research that they're funding as taxpayers. The other thing is that we're looking for more commercial regulation, public recognition of important things that we do in the R&D laboratories. Again, because not many people are aware of the scientific meetings or some of the papers and publications that we do, they see products in the clinic, in the hospital, on the shelf, at pharmacies or other means of distribution, they can recognize the benefit that they're getting for supporting and funding research enterprises. The third reason we think we can think about is that if you have an active program, it really attracts new R&D resources from partners. These partners can be companies, these partners can be university collaborators, but these partnerships actually are a multiplier, can advance the work that you're already doing and to have more impact. And really what it's about these days is impact of science. We really need to think about this and make sure that really are having the impact that we like from the amount of work and effort and funding that goes into the projects that we do. The fourth element here is sort of return on investment. And here we're not really talking about a return on financial investment in, say, kind of a Wall Street type of sense, but really a return on investment for research, for public health. So the idea that some of these things that we're funding, even though they may be very early stage, very basic science, they're often fundamental in nature, but they can lead to important developments. We'd like to be able to measure and to be able to show this return on investment. Yes, there's some financial return in terms of royalties back to the institution, sometimes from commercialization, but really we're looking for sort of public health return on investment. Sometimes that's a little bit harder to measure, but it's a focus for us as well. Last but not least, we're looking also at economic development issues. If you look back at sort of the origins of technology transfer in the late 70s and early 80s, it's really an economic development issue that really kind of stimulated the passage of the laws, the Bayh-Dole Act, Stevenson-Wilder Act, to really kind of stimulate the US economy, creating more jobs, manufacturing. So part of this technology transfer also is to help grow the economy, help provide new economic incentives in our system. So all these are kind of rolled in together. And you think a public health institution, we're probably looking at sort of the first one. Public health is the most important thing for us. But again, these are all five of these are an important part of the overall process. So we can look at sort of, if you're looking at sort of why you should care about technology transfer, There's a lot of interdisciplinary fields in science, but this one is very important because, as you can see here, it connects scientific discovery with commercialization. So this is through technology transfer, and the glue is typically intellectual property or patents. It's provide the incentive for commercialization. So we have the scientific discovery on one side, we have the commercialization and product development on the other, but it's this connector, and that's why it's so important to make sure that your work, your scientific discoveries, the work that you're working on in the laboratory is connected to commercialization through intellectual property and patents to make sure that you really have the impact that you expect to have or can have. So looking at this in terms of two different areas, it's this transition. Well, the first one part is sort of scientific invention. And I have a quote here from Kerry Mullis, who many of you probably recognize as a Nobel Prize winner developing PCR, polymerase chain reaction. And his quote is, "It's not an occupation for the elite." And what that means is that some of the things that we work on in scientific discovery, well, maybe not stuff that would always generate a first author paper in a prestige journal, could be very important for development, could be an important part of the commercialization process. So you think about it, the inventions are important, but not everything is important inventions. So you have to think about this process, how you can connect things, even though they may not be always prestigious, but maybe very important for development. And looking at sort of development itself, here, it's a process, particularly in life science. We have regulatory review, we have clinical trials. So you have to kind of think about this and have some patience and work the system. And I've noted here that it's a marathon, not a sprint, as probably one of the world's slowest marathon runners. I can vouch for this. It really is not a sprint, but about a gradual process, but an important part that scientists are connected to as we seek to really kind of develop the ideas coming from your laboratory. So here's a nice graphic showing the overall process. You can see that for life sciences, it has a bit of twists and turns. Sometimes there's loops backwards because we don't always get the answer. We don't always get the idea that we can really develop right away. Sometimes there's trial and error, and sometimes we learn also, as you can appreciate, from things that go wrong or things that don't go as well as we thought. So this gives the idea, but this means that you have to think about the process and think about how the work that you're doing can fit in from the discovery side and make sure that you have connections through technology transfer and development to all the other players, other partners that you can utilize in developing your ideas through the goal. So you can see it's quite an effort. There is accelerated development for some instances, but overall, sometimes you're looking at 5, 7, 10 years process as you go through this, particularly things that have large-scale clinical trials as part of it. We're working here with humans as well as animals and cell lines and mice, and the human process can't be underestimated in terms of its focus on safety and making sure that the efficacy is really there. So again, you have to think about the long road. So this creates kind of a dilemma for you in the laboratory. You can see that the invention that you might have made is only a start, and the whole process and working with companies can be very interesting, very different, but it could be a distraction for some of your basic studies. So how do you balance this? How do you do it carefully and effectively? Well, you're going to be talking with patent attorneys. So hopefully that's not too painful for you, but but again, you're going to be interacting with people in a tech transfer program, a patent attorney. All this is going to be part of sort of your new network, your new circle of close friends that help really aid and guide you through this overall process. So, and just like science is sometimes unpredictable, development, research and the development part, it can be difficult as well. So we have to have access to these types of resources. You can make informed decisions. The process can work well to support your science. So what are the things that you need to be thinking about to aid that, your role as a scientist? First of all, you want to be able to share and keep accurate laboratory notebooks. Historically, they've been bound. Now, of course, we're talking more digital notebooks, but this is an essential element to actually record the information, and have them validated through dates and signatures. You really need to be able to establish what it is that you've done. It's been very important for the overall process in case there's ever any challenges or any questions about it, and you'll want this information anyway for your scientific publications. The other thing to be thinking about is disclosures. Obviously, as scientists, we're very focused on talking to other scientists, making presentations, publications and such, but we have to be careful about disclosing that information before we've done our filing, because if you do it prematurely, you lose your access to US patent rights. Yeah, and this is probably the world's largest market. So you have to think about working with your tech transfer office before you make that talk, before the abstract is published on the website. Be sure that you've actually protected your rights so you can have the real impact that you're hoping to have both in the United States and other markets throughout the world, because really biomedicine is really a global market these days. So how do you do this? Obviously, work with your tech transfer office, your program. Just about every institution that has a research program will have this in place. These have been in place now for 30 or 40 years. You'll be working with law firms and commercial partners. So there's a lot of different players, but think of these as additional resources to help support your project, additional information to help guide the development of your ideas. You'll have transfer agreements and confidential things to make sure that your information is protected. And you really need to be sure that you're focusing on your ideas and making sure that your activities are supporting the development of your ideas and not necessarily always aiming to please someone who just asks for information. It doesn't take that long to put together these agreements to kind of protect you and protect your institution from premature disclosures or other types of activities that you may not want and may injure your actual overall program that you're hoping to achieve. So what are some of the things to be thinking about? The key questions that we ask. So you can see that these aren't scientific questions. The scientific questions are things that you would be asking, that you would be deciding that. But what we were looking for is sort of, what is it? Can we really describe it? And so what? Why is it important? What's the application? What's the utilization? And then who cares? How does this impact people? What's the utilization? So it's not really about the individual scientist, but really what kind of comes afterwards that we're really focusing on. And it's important to think about, because the technology transfer process is not really a scientific review, not really a critique of your laboratory, but rather sort of like what happens next. And these are some of the questions that you may be asked in terms of to help guide the development and commercialization of your idea. So one thing to keep in mind is that the coolness of the science will not necessarily help IP commercialization. Well, here's an example of from one of my colleagues had pointed out from the Big Bang Theory. I think most of you have seen the show, perhaps more than a few times. And in one of the episodes, the scientists, the guys, create a mobile app where you can take a photo of a quadratic equation and it solves it. So that's a pretty cool scientific application. You could see that. Total market, well, maybe some of their colleagues, 70 friends, are less valuable. Important, valuable, maybe not so valuable. However, their friend down the hall, Penny, creates an app where you take a photo of a shoe and tells you where you can buy a pair. More valuable? Think about the commercialization market. Perhaps so. Is it as important scientifically? Maybe not. But you can see what we're looking at is that not critiquing the science, really thinking about what the market is. Can it really be transferred? 70 friends, maybe not so important for patenting activity, maybe just publications and sharing among colleagues. However, something that could be a wide applicable for just about anyone who looking for shoes, you can see that that could be very important for commercialization, having a wide sort of impact from technology transfer. Granted, this is a kind of a trivial example, but gives you an idea of some of the things that may not be totally scientifically exciting, but may be very important in terms of the marketplace. So the question then would be, is that this commercialization, is it worth it? Why should I spend all any time on this? Well, the answer is worth it. It's part of the job of scientists and research organizations. So there is actually an expectation that scientists, when they make discoveries, report these so they can be evaluated and considered for dissemination and commercialization. And you think about it, the public, and it's the public that's supporting a lot of this R&D efforts through taxes and other support, they benefit when new products come in the marketplace. Again, they're not reading the scientific literature, but they do really appreciate new ideas, new vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics tests, what it is the area that you're working on when those become available. So, but to do this, however, development usually requires patent protection. So it enable companies to justify the investment that it takes to develop. So there's financial risk, market risk, there's risk from regulatory risk. So there's a lot of risk and a lot of cash that's sometimes needed to take these developments out from the bench. So you think about that, you can patent protection, you can always start it at the beginning and then later abandon it if it's not successful or if it's not really, turns out to be not really of commercial interest. But once you can't restart it. So it's important to do this on the front end and always discontinue it if it turns out, if that's appropriate, but you can't restart it. You can't sort of wait and after it's been disclosed and then start it. So it's an important part to work with your office on the front end. So the questions that sometimes we get is that, won't this interfere, this whole technology transfer, this commercialization, will it interfere with sharing of reagents? We think about it, sharing of reagents is a very important process of working in laboratories. It doesn't need to share, it doesn't need to impact sharing. You can share these activities. The other question is, what about the culture of publish or perish? Can we have both patents and publications? Yes, we can. And basically, it's to make sure that before the publication or the disclosure occurs, that you've had that conversation with the tech transfer officer and have the opportunity to file before the publication. So most offices typically ask the scientists when the publication is coming out and then adjust the patent filings to make sure that it's done before the publication comes out from the journal or published on the website. So you can have both. It's not an either or situation. So here's kind of the how this whole process works out from the bench to the customer. You can see that this is kind of a linear process here: scientific discovery, intellectual property, technology transfer, and it's accessing financial capital for development. There's corporate partnering, there's clinical discoveries, there's regulatory, manufacturing, sales, and marketing. So it's a whole long chain of events that's triggered by the scientific discovery and intellectual property. So you have to think about this in terms of how long it's going to take, the patients that may be involved, and the other players, the other part that are going to be assisting this process. It's not a single person type of activity anymore, see, even a single institution activity. It's something that's through a long chain of activities and things to really kind of move this project along until it's actually out on the marketplace. And so this glue or this process of kind of hold things together, that's really kind of technology transfer. It's business development people at companies and attorneys, either contract attorneys or patent attorneys, all part of this business, this legal, the science mix that goes into all this. Very important aspect to keep in mind. So how does this overall process work? Well, typically at universities and federal laboratories, there's a process at the laboratory to evaluate inventions for commercialization. Again, it's not a scientific review, but a commercialization and a patent review that we go through. In doing this, the lab people, either with or the outside attorneys, work closely with the inventors to make sure they understand the invention and have an understanding perhaps of the local system, ecosystem around that piece of technology in terms of other activities, potential partners and such. So we tend to work then with law firms to manage the patents for filing. That can be a fairly long process as well in terms of the patent prosecution, and manage the portfolio as well. So this is all something that's a very active area for the technology transfer office. Then once we've done the filing and have this activity, we're looking to negotiate agreements with commercial partners to develop the idea. And then managing a relationship. You can see with that long road towards development, it could be a long-term relationship, and we want to manage that relationship with commercial partners to go through that whole process and hopefully have an interesting and useful product come out at the end. So where does this fit in the institutional mission? Well, at NIH and FDA's research program, as well as the CDC, it's basically to make sure that we serve a process, a function as part of Health and Human Services. It's our department in the federal government to make sure that in terms of biomedical technology transfer and policy and practice, to really kind of make sure this process goes through. And it's really, again, focus on using intellectual property, using patents, using technology transfer to improve public health. So with that, you need to think about how do you start that at any institution. So we've kind of talked about the why, in terms of why it's important. Well, how do you get started? Well, I think you need to have institutional policies. And we have that in the federal government in terms of laws and regulations. We have that in policies at the institutional level. And similarly at institutions, at research institutions, at universities, there's often those types of things in place as well. Very typically there are. You've got to know your portfolio in terms of your inventors, your scientists, your filings. You need to know your market. So what's the business opportunity? And then know the customers. Who are the partners? Who are the people that are more likely to work with your laboratories, do collaborations with your investigators, and more importantly, develop your ideas into the marketplace. So it's a whole kind of chain of events, but you have to start with sort of these fundamental activities, these fundamental things set up through your technology transfer program at your institution. This overall process, you can think of it a little bit as a balancing act. So you're looking at sort of long-term projects. You want to have public access, have competition in the marketplace, improve public health. Other hand, there's a lot of investment, private risk. So you have to be thinking about how do you balance that with institutional goals, with company goals. So often that does require exclusive licensing and some financial returns incentives for the company. So you think about this in terms of balancing this, and it's not always the same answer each time. It's very situation dependent, but you're thinking about, well, what's in the best interest of getting the projects out and supporting not only public health, public benefit, but also economic growth and company growth as well, to make sure that both parties are incentivized to go through this process. So in terms of patents themselves, why would an institution want to seek this, or why, an example of NIH, what's kind of the NIH patent policy? So we're not really seeking patents for patents sake itself. You think about it, the patents come from the Patent and Trademark Office, another government agency. So why would one government agency, let's say NIH, go all the expense and bother of getting a patent from another government agency? We don't really need it to do our research, but we would seek patent protection if it's going to facilitate availability and development, particularly something that's going to be a diagnostic, a preventative, a therapeutic, or something that has commercial utilization. And we also look at the technology itself, and if it needs further research and development to really kind of get it on the marketplace, well, that's where patent protection can be used as an incentive to attract that development from a commercial partner. We also look at the public health value or the commercial value of the idea. So it could be financial value or unmet medical need. And sort of, if that's the case, then it's worth the effort to try this process in order to get development of these ideas. And we want to be sure that there's practical application, practical utility to make sure that things that we're working on can actually be used in real life situations. So those are the criteria that many institutions like the NIH use to assess an idea. You can see it's not a scientific assessment, but really relating to sort of future R&D and development, as well as commercialization. On the other hand, these would be examples of when we would not seek patent protection. A lot of things can be patented, but we don't necessarily need to do that for everything coming from the research laboratory. And there, if we decide that commercialization and technology transfer can be done without patent protection, we don't file, we save the money. The savings could be hundreds of thousands of dollars on individual case if you include the foreign patent filing. Other thing we look at is something, if it's just better to just publish it and get it out, that information, that data set, it's not really a commercial product, but it's something that a lot of people would find interesting and useful. Publication alone sometimes is sufficient. So this is kind of the assessment, the rubric that we go through. And sometimes we find that licensees only want the materials. So materials sometimes are part of the discovery, cell lines, animal models, antibodies. that don't really have necessarily a direct therapeutic use, but useful in R&D efforts, they really only want the materials. They don't really care about the patent, excluding anyone. So if it's unpatented, if it's material, and we don't need patent protection for this type of application, we'll transfer it without that. So that's also a very important part of the process, is to still do the transfer, but not necessarily incur the patent expense if it's not merited. So this is a bit of a process, and can this process make scientists and institution rich? And the answer is typically not, unfortunately. Basically, though, academic and federal labs do share license and royalty income with individual inventors. So it is a collaborative process. There are financial incentives, and they vary by institutions. The academics, the universities, perhaps a little more generous than the federal labs in terms of that, because the federal lab statutes are very specific, but it's pretty much written in that it's shared with the institution and with the inventors. So there's caps on in most institutions, and restrictions on level of commercial involvement, vary by institution but the largest rewards and the largest risk can be found from entrepreneur activity. So if that's of interest, in terms of controlling a process, managing a process, and having more upside, that's where entrepreneur activity comes in. And why is that important? Well, sometimes we find that scientists will decide that they want to become entrepreneurial and work their project a little further in development. And that's because sometimes the activity from research are very early, very leading edge, and they're not always appreciated or understood by existing firms. It's too early for them, needs some further development. It's not, maybe market seems uncertain. This is a great opportunity for a faculty-led startup. At NIH, the faculty member would need to leave to become an entrepreneur. At university, sometimes can be spin out directly, and the investigator can keep his or her job. And so basically, it's the entrepreneur that actually stimulates this development of these new ideas that look very promising, but are high risk and uncertain in terms of their commercial applications. So with this, we're seeing a way to sort of seed this new knowledge outside of the research institution, leading to new firms, new industry, job creation, economic growth, all the things we talked about a little earlier in terms of economic activity. Can be driven a lot by this entrepreneur spirit. So what's interesting is that the ivory tower only image of scientists are changing. Economic development agencies are recognizing the power of scientific discovery and helping to recruit certain scientists who they think will have future ideas that could be spun off into companies. A very important part. And they become recognized as sort of their participation in the global economic village. Historically, there's been a difference between the US and other countries, but that difference is closing. It's not, US has traditionally led in this activity for a variety of reasons that we'll talk about, but other countries are getting on the bandwagon and saying this is a possibility as well. So what do some of the studies show in terms of entrepreneurs? Well, it's not because of geographic origin, because many of the entrepreneurs in the US are not native US born. It's more about the infrastructure, the support system at the institution, at the state, at the national level that kind of support this activity. The classic example, of course, the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980, which permitted grantees, particularly at universities and small companies, to keep and manage discoveries that they make during the grant. So that's seen as sort of a fundamental starting point for this type of activity. And grants, particularly SBIR companies, funding to companies, is very important for entrepreneurship. And this study is a little older, but the one showed that for this period of time that 25%, 1 in 4 of grant recipients from NCI actually started their own company based upon some of the work they were doing under the grant. I mentioned SBIR, Small Business and Research, is very much a stimulant for small companies, development. These are R&D projects that can move from prototype to a proof of principle. and help sort of develop the concepts coming from small companies. There's a number of ecosystems. You'll see this around universities or economic development agencies, including incubators, technology parks, training programs, and social networks. These are all things that help stimulate the process and help manage and provide some continuity for this activity as it goes forward. However, patents, it's really about patents here. They're kind of the rocket fuel for this development. Without the patents, it's really hard for entrepreneurs to attract investment. It's really very important to have this so that the risk capital feels comfortable in making the investment in the idea. So how do you grow these type of activities? Well, you can see that a lot of, particularly in the biotech, a lot of healthcare area, a lot of very fundamental scientists have, very fundamental discoveries, projects, new products have come from entrepreneur activity. So this is a very, very proven, at this point, at 2023, a very proven way of doing this. And it's interesting that when we see the funding and training of scientists, especially at academic research centers, it's really kind of, we're seeding the next wave of enough companies. Not every company, of course, succeeds, but this process of seeding scientists and stimulating their ideas is a very excellent way of providing the next generation of healthcare, the next generation of innovative products. And this all supported by at the university or by the federal lab, by various business, intellectual property, or entrepreneur training programs. So the whole idea that there is an ecosystem, there's support, there's things, because these aren't things that we typically covered when we were in grad school as scientists, but these are things that are important for the overall process, and have access to that at your institution is very important. So in terms of summing up, in terms of commercialization, what we're seeing that it's not sort of a one-off type of activity. It's increasingly integrated into the overall goal of the research program. So the tech transfer office is part of the overall process. It's not just another administrative office, bureaucratic office at the institution, but something that's fundamental, something that's really part of the overall process to really see the impact of science really realized. So that's an important part to think about. It's a resource for you as a scientist, resource for you as an inventor. The other thing is that increase the public awareness of the science, public impact, by saying that products. That way the public has a greater understanding of the value of science. Sometimes it's not so clear that they do, or sometimes the congressional staff or agencies don't always seem to understand, but the products kind of speak for themselves. It's a very important part of the process. And having then making the investment at the institution to have the support mechanisms, staff and tech transfer office, in the grants office, funds for development and such is a very important part of the process as well. Again, to make sure that these good ideas that come from the laboratory can actually be realized. However, the highest opportunity, the most generous opportunity, I guess, for impact and rewards for scientists come from entrepreneur activity away from the laboratory. So there's institutional support for scientists to stay within, but for the greatest opportunity and the greatest rewards, those come from entrepreneur activity. So I hope you'll be able to consider either activity within your institution on discoveries from the science that you're working on, or thinking about how you can work in your local entrepreneur ecosystem, take some ideas from your institution and move forward for development. So with that, I think we'll wrap it up for today. I hope you've got some good ideas, some things that you can work on. And please let us know if we can be of further assistance. So thank you very much for listening today, and I hope to be in contact with you soon.